Alrighty. Without further ado, let's get into our articles for today. So, the first one we're going to be talking about is a little bit of the situation going on in Ukraine. Um, the US has been just shoveling money into their war effort. And I know at first it may seem that that's, a noble thing. And I do believe that Ukraine, it deserves its own sovereignty. And obviously they don't deserve to be invaded by invaded by Russia and bombed to the freaking Stone Age. But the reason why the US is supporting them is not for moral reasons. It's all about the chess game that the US plays to try and maintain imperial dominance. So without further ado, let's get into the article. All right, so we have this article from the BBC, written by Barbara Platt Usher. Excuse me. Blinken flies in to rally Western support for Ukraine war. I'll get there, I promise. All right, President Joe Biden wants to end America's forever wars, but he is pumping billions of dollars into one that could grind on for a long time. After 6 months, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is entering a challenging new phase. Europe is facing a hard winter of high prices and fuel shortages because of the fallout from sanctions against Moscow and President Vladimir Putin's suspension of Russian gas pipelines or gas supplies. Yeah, so if you guys haven't heard what's going on over there, it's truly freaking crazy. I covered it on the stream yesterday. In places like the UK and places in Europe who relied heavily on Russian gas, it's going to be a shit show this winter, man. I saw some figures about the UK that are projecting that yearly gas cost to heat a home is going to be around like 700 and something pounds a month. I said yearly, monthly, 750 pounds monthly, which is around like $800 a month just to have power in the home. So they're going to be facing a lot of unrest, a lot of protests, and obviously that's what Russia wants because they're sort of retaliating for the sanctions put against them by, mostly members of NATO and the US. So let's get back into this. Meanwhile, Ukraine has launched a counteroffensive in the south of the country to try to break a stalemate on the battlefield and convince struggling allies it's worth staying the course. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Kyiv was designed to underline the message by emphasizing the Americans are committed to seeing this through. Excuse me. He announced a further $2.8 billion in military aid during a meeting with Ukrainian leader Vladimir Zelensky after entering the presidential building through a series of dark hallways fortified with sandbags. He also visited children injured by Russian bombardments and toured a devastated section of a nearby Irpin, seeing firsthand the scorched buildings and scattered debris left behind by Russian shelling of the city. For Washington, of course, the stakes are bigger than Ukraine. The Biden administration and a bipartisan majority in Congress believes the Russian invasion threatens to rip up the rules of the liberal global order largely established by the US after World War II. And again, I've talked about this on the stream before. After World War II, the US kind of became the dominant force in the world, and that's obviously the way it's been for decades and decades and decades. But now the Russian war against Ukraine was kind of a catalyst that shook NATO and the US and really the world and made everyone question if that hegemony still exists. So the US, like I said, is really trying to shore themselves up and exert that power. And the way that they're doing that with Ukraine is they don't want the war necessarily to end, as the article will get into somewhat, but they really want a forever war. They want a war that will drain Russia and cripple them for the foreseeable future so they and NATO can maintain their dominance on the global stage, which is slipping. Some analysts and lawmakers have described the goal as preventing defeat rather than powering a win, which is what I was just describing. and demanded the president be more aggressive. Others have said a win isn't possible and urged him to press for a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement. We are focused on helping ensure Ukraine prevails in this war, said a second senior U.S. official, so that when we get to the day where we move to a negotiated settlement, Ukraine is in the strongest possible position. Again, it's not about the Ukraine being in the strongest possible position, it's about the U.S. The U.S. doesn't do anything unless it benefits itself and the corporate freaking oligarchs and overlords that run this shit. His visit to Ukraine will give him a fresh feel, a fingertip assessment to try to hold together Western support for Ukraine heading into the annual UN General Assembly, said the first U.S. official. Allies need to present a narrative that the world is facing adverse consequences because of Mr. Putin's war. And like I said, the world definitely is, at least the traditional first war. I mean, all of them, but the reason why this is so urgent for the U.S. and NATO, the UN, all of those, like I said, traditionally first world countries, is that this is really the first time where the structures in place are starting to crumble to a point because of all of this geopolitical instability that they aren't sure if their dominance will last or if their dominance is coming to an end. Like, it's always about power politics on the geopolitical stage, man. It always is. That's what happens when you have people banded together in tribes trying to take as much as they can while leaving the world out to dry, especially third world countries. You know what I mean? The Russian president claims the adverse consequences are the result of U.S.-led aggression against Russia, aimed at preserving an unjust world order beneficial only to the West. And he's not wrong. I mean, it's funny because both sides have propaganda points that are true. There aren't really any good guys in this situation. You know what I mean? And that includes Ukraine. You know what I mean? They have a huge problem with racism and Nazism over there, which, I mean, to be fair, is in a lot of freaking European countries. And like I said, even with those problems, that doesn't mean that Ukraine deserves to be invaded. Like I said, it's complicated, it's not black and white. I mean, the one thing that is black and white is that, come on, Russia shouldn't be going into Ukraine, killing civilians, and trying to revitalize some dead dream of a united Eastern Europe. It's just Putin, who was, a KGB agent, trying to reignite what he sees as the glory days of Russia. You know what I mean? But yeah, I mean, I wanted to bring up this article because the U.S. so far has spent $54 billion in Ukraine. Now, in the grand scheme of things, like, that's a very small percentage of the U.S.'s, yearly budget. But this spending goes to show you that they truly do not give a fuck about the economic security and happiness of the people who reside within the United States. They spend all this money on war and death and destruction to maintain their imperial dominance, man. When so much money has been wasted that could have went to programs that lifted people up, lifted people out of poverty, fed people in the U.S. And I'm not saying that the U.S. shouldn't help Ukraine. I think they should, but the way that they're helping is just stoking the flames of war and could literally lead to nuclear annihilation. They're playing with fire. I want to take a look at what the U.S. has actually spent all this money on. And I mean, it's not surprising. The vast majority of it, the vast majority of it is going to be in weapons. You know what I mean? This is a little bit nebulous. Economic support fund. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but you have that at 8.8 billion, food assistance 4.3, and this is the more recent bill, military assistance 6 billion. So a lot of money, and they're sending these thousands and thousands of weapons of mass destruction over there, man. And I'm not saying that they don't need these things to stave off the Russian invasion, but I personally don't think that it's in our place to be doing this. Like, the US is prodding at Russia, which is already run by a nefarious individual who does not care about the body count in his quest for some kind of misguided Russian glory. You know what I mean? It's insane. And the Russian government has already shown that they're willing to gamble with nuclear weapons on this and sending all of these weapons over. I mean, if that's not a declaration of war, I don't know what is. We need to be smarter about this. And like the article alluded to, we need to try to build bridges instead of burn them. We need to try to find diplomatic solution to these problems, because our leaders are still in that mindset of divide and conquer when it comes to the global stage. What they're thinking about is not how to limit human suffering. They're trying to see how they can use this as an advantage to stay on top of the global order. And like I said, they spent 54 billion on this. Now, what could we do with 54 billion dollars in the United States? And like I said again, we can send them this money, and like I said, minus the military stuff, in my opinion, that's not the problem. The problem is they're willing to spend this money over in the Ukraine to play these, like I said, chess games, but they're not willing to spend. Let's get into it here. According to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, it would cost $20 billion to end homelessness in the United States. Just $20 billion. That is not that much for the United States to spend. And it's disgusting to me that we even have any homeless people in the United States. We're the biggest economy in the world. We're the richest nation on earth. And we have, I think, the highest homeless population and the highest amount of people in hunger in any developed nation in the world. It's disgraceful. It goes on to say that is a big number, yes, but let's put it into perspective. Americans spend $19 billion a year on unplugged appliances. Americans spend more than $35 billion a year on gym memberships. The US government spent around $718 billion on its military in 2019 alone. So there you go, folks. That's how you know where your government's priorities lie. It's not about helping you. It's not about making sure that you have a life that's prosperous and fruitful. It's about maintaining psychotic control over the world. And there's more things we could do with $54 billion instead of spending all that money on death and destruction. How much would it cost in hunger in the US? Joel Berg, CEO of Hunger Free America, has calculated the cost of ending hunger in the US at $25 billion. Again, both of these things, how much is that? 20 billion, 25 billion. 45 billion to end hunger and homelessness in the US. And we can't do that, but we can spend $54 million on a war. It's we live in a crazy, backwards, upside down world, man. It breaks my heart that all this suffering is happening when it's just so preventable. It's disheartening, but I say it in all the streams that I do. The world is on the precipice of either being paradise on earth or hell on earth, man. And it's up to people who care and understand that this kind of order isn't sustainable to push us into a direction of light and happiness and brotherhood, man. That's just what we need right now. And we see people, especially young people, stepping up to the plate and trying to get this world to be born, and it's totally possible within our lifetimes. It really is. And you know, this obviously isn't a new phenomenon with the United States. They've been playing this game ever since they became the global superpower. A perfect example of this is the the war on terror, where we spent $8 trillion and almost a million and probably over a million people dead for nothing, literally for nothing. All the war on terror did was exacerbate extremism across the globe, because the U.S. really didn't have a reason to go into these places except for, when you know it, oil and profiteering. And profiteering, global capitalist enterprise, it inevitably leads to this type of destruction, because it's a system that is profit at all costs. Now, we spent $8 trillion on basically a 21st century crusade, when shifting the US to 100% renewables would cost $4.5 trillion. So we could have already done significant, groundbreaking, revolutionary progress to stop climate change and create a world where our children can live in, but we spent almost twice as much of that to have some kind of freaking holy war in the Middle East, man. It's freaking crazy. It's it leaves you speechless, man. It's insane to think that we live in such a system that just so severely devalues human life and promotes human suffering in the name of imaginary lines and numbers, man. It can't stand. We have to do things to try and change this, you know?